welcome to the latest edition of Move the Needle. I am one of your co-hosts, Lee Grigsby. My co I always get that wrong,
This
trying
way,
to
this
point.
way.
Yeah, that side, that side. Other co-host, Jay Wilcox, coming in from across the pond. Jay, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Lee. Very well indeed, yes.
Good, 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 good. Um, so, folks, I hope you took in last episode. I know we had a lot to cover. We may have touched on so many different things last episode, but we really want to focus on. I'm sorry, we're just jumping right into it, I guess, right? But
Mm-hmm.
this conversation is really about race and how race was created, and let's have that conversation, right? So, Jay, before I share any of the slides, any video, is there anything that you'd like to share about what you think about race, what you've learned, and just start off the conversation?
Um, One thing that has really struck me whilst I've been reading around this a lot recently is the fact that um, I actually think that I've been really privileged because uh, where I grew up in Birmingham, um, in Birmingham, England, not Birmingham, Alabama.
Jay, you're from
Uh,
Birmingham, Alabama? I did not know that. Sorry, sorry.
well, you can't tell the accent. Uh, and the, it's in the UK. It's the second city. It's a big industrial center, manufacturing center. Sorry, and it's got a very diverse population. And
Okay.
right from the beginning, I was at school with many different ethnic groups in the schools that I went to in that
Hmm.
city. Um, and without knowing it, without realizing it, I think I had a very fortunate start in life, that I was surrounded by people from all colors, religions, and cultures.
Sure.
Um, and from a very young age, where you don't question, because as people, as humans, we're actually entirely accepting of other humans. We're actually we don't actually see the different colors of our skin as a problem as children. We don't. That's something that's taught as we grow older, and that's the thing that I'm very grateful for. I'm very
Hmm.
grateful that I had that start in life.
Hmm.
um, and as through life, things come at you and you have to overcome certain challenges, constructs, and you question your own realities and philosophies. Um, but I realize just how important it is to remember that as as the human animal that we are, we're entirely accepting of everybody else, regardless
Hmm.
of skin color
Hmm.
or cultural background. And I think
I
that's just fundamentally important for me.
I would agree that at a young age, yes, we see the differences,
Mm,
but we're accepting of them because it
yeah,
at the young age where we haven't been jaded by life
mm,
yet, that it doesn't matter what even as far as not just skin color, right? But we don't even know differences in belief and religion at that point.
mm,
And if you even are around kids with disabilities, you might
yeah,
know they're different, and there might be some kids who make fun of them, right? That kids can be cruel, but overall, for the majority of kids at a young age, it tends to be accepting of differences because you're
and,
worried about or you think about how do they treat you, right? As that how do they treat you? How can you play together? Do you play
mm,
this game, that game, right? That's helps with the accepting part. So I agree with you that um and you said something very poignant as well, the human animal that we are.
mm,
Um I'll touch on that later when we start when we dive into slavery and the differences of slavery. And I know people, you're like, wait, slavery is slavery, right? No, slavery is not all the same.
Mm.
So,
No,
um,
not at all. Not at all.
without further, oh yeah, what would you like to add before I go ahead and put the slides up?
Um, no, probably the only other thing which is quite curious there is that yeah, we I was talking about as children, but I think even as adults, you mentioned about being jaded, or and
Mhm.
unfortunately, we do become influenced by ideas and slogans and conditioning as we grow. But sometimes you travel to far off places, and other people can be interested in your skin, in your color, in the feel of your hair, and it's not to that to do you down. It's not to single you out. It's just curiosity. And I think that it's all right to be curious. It's nice to be curious about who we are. I don't see anything wrong with that. If someone wants to touch another person's hair or feel their skin, that's fine. We are just people. And we as people, we don't use those differences um, on a simple human level against each other.
Mhm.
It becomes far more complex and insidious when it gets to that level, and it's
When
nothing
it
to do
goes
with
past the
simply
curiosity, yeah,
when it goes
when it
past
goes,
curiosity and the level
yeah.
of acceptance of a different colored man or woman. Yes, when those constructs come in, it takes on a very dark and insidious nature.
Well, great segue. And speaking about
Mhm.
dark and insidious, um,
Yes.
I'll go ahead and add the slides here. I'm calling this episode Bacon's Rebellion, and I gotta put out the obligatory joke that no, we're not talking about a rebellion on pork or anything like that.
Hmm.
That's a different show for a different time. Um, but I'm calling this Bacon's Rebellion because um, this is really about. These are the references, by the way. These are the links. It's about race. It's about this historical context of race and how it's a social construct and how it was created. Um, so while those two link in, again, I'll put them in the show notes for anyone who wants to check them out. I do believe that the bottom link, you need to be here in the states in order to see that. I don't think you can be outside of the states. Um, so I will actually share real quick what the second link is, because this is what that second link is about. It's from public broadcasting here in the United States, and there's a series that they did about the history of white people in America. And so there's a quick explanation of what this series is about. And they have these 3 episodes that are short, um, very short videos, less than 10, 15 minutes, I believe. The first one is how America invented race. The second one is how America outlawed interracial marriage. And then the third episode is how America made skin color power. So, with that in mind, um, that's why I'm using these references in that particular link. Sorry, didn't mean to chop us off camera there. um, but that's why I'm using those links, because those give historical context as to how race was created. I want to share these 2 quotes also. Um, the first quote being from, I don't know how to say his name, David Rodiger, but the world got along without race for the overwhelming majority of its history. The U.S. has never been without it. Let that sink in for a minute.
Mhm.
And then the next
Very
quote
deep.
is race is the child of racism, not the father. And that is by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He was also the author of Between the World and Me. Um, but I think those 2 quotes really add some context to what we're talking about and how race was created. Um,
Mm.
any thoughts before I dive into specifically when and how race was created and used? Any thoughts yet, or about
But I
specifically?
think we need to dive in because the foundation
Okay.
there is important, really, to understand, especially that second notion about race being the child of racism. Because
Hmm.
once you've understood the emergence of the notion of race, that really crystallizes that phrase, that wonderful quote.
I think so. All right, so we will dive in then. Um, Race is a human invented shorthand term used to describe and categorize people in various social groups based on characteristics like skin color, physical features, genetic heredity. Race is not a valid biological concept. It is a real social construct that gives or denies benefits and privileges. The American society developed this notion of race early in its formation to justify, and here we go, folks. You've heard me say follow the money, right? So again, the American society developed this notion of race early in its formation to justify its new economic system of capitalism. And that new system depended on the institution of forced labor, especially the enslavement of African people. More accurately, or to more accurately understand how race and its counterpart, racism, are woven into the American society, we have to explore the history of race, white privilege, and how anti blackness came to be. So, this concept of race, as we understand it today, it's evolved and it's changed, especially here in the United States, and it's deeply connected to white and slave, those words. But the words race, white, and slave were all used by Europeans in the 1500s, and they brought these words with them to North America. During the 17th century, European enlightened philosophers based their ideas on the importance of secular reasoning, rationality, and scientific study, as opposed to faith based religious understandings of the world. These beliefs, which evolved started in the late 18th century and flourished in the late 18th century, argued that there were natural laws that governed the world and human beings. Over the centuries, this false notion of white people became inherently smarter, more capable, and more human than non-white people became accepted. The the categorization of
Yay.
people became a justification for European colonization and subsequent enslavement of people from Africa. So let's just pause there for a minute and digest some of that because that's quite a bit. Um, but yes, so the race is a social
Mhm.
construct that was created to categorize people and create this illusion, if you will, that different categories were better or worse than the other categories. And depending on which category you fell in, you had privileges or then you were denied privileges. I
Mhm.
turn the floor over to you, sir.
Well, of course, and that the the idea there, as it was mentioned in the slides, there were
Mm-hmm.
behind this categorization.
Mm-hmm.
We had that separation of white or non-white, because I think initially it was I'm right in saying it was white and non-white rather than sort of white and black.
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
And even the what we might ordinarily now call white or white Europeans, the white males, what we see as white males, didn't consider themselves white. Is that right? Because it
That
was
that that is correct. Well, so great segue. We'll get there. You're absolutely right with that. I do want
my
to mention also how the philosophers, like as I said in the 1500s, they started to change, or sorry, in the late 17th century, so 1600s, started changing their philosophies into the natural laws, right? They went away from the religious or faith based, man, I cannot talk today, the faith based ideas that um so I'll put it, this might be an unpopular opinion, but when we start talking about the wars over religion, Christianity has been one of those religions that I don't know other way to say it other than twisted, right? It's been twisted to you for personal gain. If you look
mm,
at Christianity at its core, Christianity is about what Christ did. And I'm making it real base first of all, right? Because the other difference is that Christianity, okay, we won't dive into that because we don't have the time. That's a whole nother show. But Christianity has been warped and twisted for personal gain. That's why we had different wars with different religions, okay? But this points to philosophers moving away from faith based thought into a natural order of thinking for human beings. Okay? So let's jump back into the slides and we'll get to the point that you just made about European men were not considered white. So then, and let's also put out here, right? Slavery actually has been a concept that's existed for centuries. Enslaved people or slaves were forced labor for another. We can point to this in the Hebrew Bible, in ancient societies, Greece, Rome, Egypt. They all had slavery during their
mhm,
eras. But the difference is, and we'll get to this too, right? Within the Mediterranean and European regions, before the 16th century, enslavement was acceptable for persons considered heathens or outside of the Christian based faith. Man, I cannot speak. So in this sense, being a slave was not for life or not hereditary.
mhm,
But the meaning and the status of slaves did not automatically transfer from parent to child either. So, in many of these cultures, slaves were still able to earn small wages, they would gather with each other, they could marry, and potentially buy their freedom. Similarly, people of darker skin, such as people from the African continent, were not automatically enslaved or considered slaves. So, before the 1600s, there's no evidence that English or the English referred to themselves as being white people. This concept did not really occur until around 1613 when English society first encountered and contrasted themselves against East Indians through colonial pursuits. So then let's go back a little bit. From the 1550s to the 1600s, white was exclusively used to describe elite English women because of the whiteness of their skin. It signaled that they were a person of high social class who did not go outside to labor. However, the term white did not refer to elite Englishmen because the idea that men did not leave their home to work could signal that they were lazy, sick, or unproductive. So let's come back out. That was the reference that you had made that originally white men, or what we know today as white men,
Mhm.
were not considered white men for that very reason, right?
Mhm.
Anything you'd like to add? And I'm letting the folks digest what we've talked about so far, but anything you'd like to add
Um,
from information we covered?
uh, a few things, yes, because I mean, in some ways, I also, on some level, I'm not even sure that the idea, the notion of race, um, by grouping people, the problem is that only when you group them um, into sort of able, or sorry, privileged and less privileged people. That's where the problem
Mm-hmm.
is. If you're just grouping them by
Mm-hmm.
characteristics,
Mm-hmm.
theoretically, what's the problem? Is it any different than nationality? I mean, really,
Right.
what's the big
Right.
deal?
Because
You know,
like if you're grouping people by characteristics, well, people who live in this area have certain characteristics over time, right?
exactly.
People have in this when we talk about the European continent or the African continent,
Mm,
not everyone looks the same, but that's genetic evolution based on
mm,
the parts of the world or that continent where they lived. And
mhm.
that is just scientific fact, right? Your
Yeah,
your biology had to evolve based on the changing of the seasons or how close you
yeah, the
were to the
environment you would live
equator, the environment.
in.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah.
And and on a very superficial level, in that sense, grouping people by race is just an easy way to understand possibly from which part of the planet people originated from.
Sure.
Uh, but then, as you mentioned before, then enters the money, of course. And when you start to realize the you mentioned the philosophers and
Yes.
the question there of the big philosophers at the core, the foundation of the United States,
Hmm.
um, and Hobbes, who was the philosopher and managed to remove, was it Hobbes or was it Locke who managed
That,
to remove religion away from it and bring
that's
politics into it?
that's
Because
it.
the
Yeah, I
moment
think
that
that
you're
was Locke.
taking,
Yeah.
was that Locke?
Yeah.
Yes, and you take the religion out and you turn it into politics, and then with Hobbes and the economy, getting turning people into commodities, so that if people are a commodity, you distinguish the commodities by groups in the same way that we use
Hmm.
barcodes. I mean, we just want simple
Yeah.
organization, simple categorization of people and
Yeah.
their relative values, like in any market.
Hmm.
And that's
It,
that's
and and
the
that
that's
de
the
and that dehumanizes whoever is the commodity. But if you don't look at someone, or if you don't look at another being as equally human, and you look at them as a commodity,
mm,
you're going to be trained to think of them as labor, as property,
that's
as
perfectly, yeah,
something less than yourself. Yeah.
exactly,
And the one
exactly,
thing I
yeah.
want to point out too is I mentioned this before we started. Not all slavery was or is has been the same, right? While I still don't necessarily agree with forced labor, right? I'm not saying that I agree with that, but as you heard and read, the slavery was different. It was forced labor, yes. I am not by any means saying that they were treated kindly, but
Mm,
it was not chattel slavery. Okay? There is a huge difference. And the slavery that existed in these societies, again, these slaves had their forced labor, they did what they had to do, but they also had their own communities and their
yeah,
own things that
communities,
they did
yeah.
outside of the forced labor. Okay? That
So
were that
so
were
you're saying that
legal.
relatively speaking, there were some freedoms granted to them.
Correct. Correct. Relatively speaking. Correct. It was legal for them to do other things once their forced labor had been completed. Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
again,
as you said
that
before, they could even buy their freedom in some cases. Yeah.
correct. Completely different from chattel slavery. That's a huge difference. All right.
Mm.
So we'll jump back in here. Jump back in. Um, oh, yes. So this concept of white or being white evolved, and the number of people considered white grew over time. And people wanted to push back against the increasing numbers of people of color. Dude, and this is more for the states than anywhere else, right? Or the then what soon to be United States. But people wanted to push back against the growing numbers of people of color due to emancipation and immigration. So this quote is interesting too. Activist Paul Kivel, I think, or Kivel, he says, whiteness is a constantly shifting boundary separating those who are entitled to have certain privileges from those whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified by their not being white. So I just want to come out here real quick. We've done an episode on the police involvement, right, with communities of color here in the United States. There's historical context to that, right? If you just saw, and I'm going to put this back up on screen. If you just saw this part here, right? The whiteness is constantly shifting boundary, and it separates those who are entitled to have certain privileges from those whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified by their not being white. That's the historical context from so much flows, right? Especially the formation of the now United States in its early stages before they were united. That's the formation of it, right? Anything you'd like to add before we keep, because we got a lot to cover, folks. So anything you'd like to add before we jump in?
Let's get to the next slide before I make a comment.
All right, there we go. So now we're starting to get into the colonization era, okay? European colonists used the word white to refer to people who looked like themselves, but grew to become entangled with the word race and slave in the American colonies back in the mid 1660s. The elites created races of savage Indians, subhuman Africans, and white men. Keep that in mind, folks. The elites in the American colonies in the mid 1660s created three races: savage Indians, subhuman Africans, and white men. The social inventions succeeded in uniting the white colonists, dispossessing and marginalizing the native and indigenous people, and permanently enslaving most African descended people for generations. Tragically, American culture from the very beginning developed around the ideas of race and racism. Okay, lot to unpack there. But this is why I continue to say and continue to press that this country, the United States, was founded on these principles. So when we've done other shows and we talked about the founding fathers, they were elites. They were considered part of the elite class. So when the Declaration of Independence was signed or created, and they're talking about, men. Well, what men are they talking about, right? We're talking about the mid 1660s. Who were they referring to? as you see, they're not referring to the indigenous people because they were savage. They were not referring to people of color or of African descent because they were enslaved, right? And depending on if you owned property or if you were an indentured servant, they may or may not have included you as a white man. So that's the context from which the forefathers of the Constitution and the United States drew up these natural laws of freedom, these Articles of Confederation. Okay? I turn the floor over to you.
Simply that the other important thing to keep in mind is the fact that there is this amazing chasm of, in terms of the meaning. I mean, on one side, there's natural right of man,
Mm-hmm.
and then the notion of liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing those two together, whilst you have slavery existing, it just seems entirely implausible. It's totally contradictory ideas. Yet they managed to make it happen. But that was also because, I mean,
Yeah.
not until relatively recently, right, that in the Constitution, non-whites were not even actually accounted for in the
That,
US Constitution.
that
So,
is correct. That is
if
correct.
they're not even included as people because they are property, then it's in, it fits with the philosophy. And the other
100,
thing here you're
100%.
saying, about the language use, the savages or subhuman.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important because language, labels, this is just constant. This is building up. This is the marketing, and this is how you create the national mentality and a subsequent normalization of an idea. And that's why it's so dangerous. And dare I say, today, a certain leader on this very same planet who is talking about, violent immigrants, dangerous dog-eating immigrants, and it's this type of thing which causes the foundation of generations of hate, mistrust, and danger for us as people.
I couldn't have said it any better, right? Language is important, and by tapping into the language that resonates with people's anger and frustration, that's how you then begin to propagandize these social constructs that keep elite elite and keep those who are not elite below. That is exactly how it's been done and continues to be done. Um, let's jump back in here because we've got a little bit more to cover. So here we go. By the late 1600s, significant shifts began to happen in the colonies. As the survival of European immigrants increased, there were more demands for land and for the labor that needed to procure this wealth. Indentured servitude lost its attractiveness because it was economically less profitable, and to utilize servants, it was, let me say that again, it was economically less profitable to utilize servants of European descent. So what do I keep saying? Follow the money, right? Follow the money. That's why indentured servants were no longer attractive. It was not profitable. This really illustrates the difference. Like the before the mid 1600s, this talks about the how the colonization or the colonies used enslaved people, indigenous people, and European indentured servants. but there was still some, if you will, civility, right? Servitude in slavery was not hereditary. It's what we talked about, right? You could potentially buy your freedom. Um, and then after the mid 1600s, that's when the focus began to change. And as you heard me just mention, the indentured servitude went away because it was no longer profitable. And as you already heard us say, these three races had been propagandized and coined over in the colonies: the savages, the subhumans, and the white men. Okay, so now moving on, this significant turning point came in 1662 in Virginia when they changed this and enacted a law of hereditary slavery. That meant that if the status of the mother, if she was a slave, then if she bore children, they were born into slavery. This law deviated from the English common law, which had assigned the legal status of children based on their father's legal status. Thus, children of enslaved women were automatically share the legal status of slave. So I got to come back out here just to put this in context, right? If we're going all the way back, we continue to talk about men and men who owned property, right? They were who were in power. They were the ones that controlled and made decisions, right? If you and going back, we've learned that there's a difference in the slavery. Okay, so we're talking about slavery in the 1500s and these ancient societies where the child's status was based off of the father's status. So if the father was not a slave, and if the father was, say, an indentured servant or a property owner, but poor, not necessarily elite, the child's status followed the father's status. Okay? As we now see in the colonies in Virginia in 1662, they changed that law that went away from the English common law and changed it so that it followed the status of the mother. So it did not matter, but if depending on the mother's status, and as we started learning, most people were now enslaved. They moved away from indentured servitude, so most people were enslaved. I just wanted to
Essentially,
really
every single child of African descent after that point was a slave.
Born into slavery. Absolutely. And that's what this came to, right? So now, in 1667, the last of the religious conditions that placed limits on servitude was erased by another law that Virginia created. This new law, it deemed that it was legal to keep enslaved people in bondage even if they converted to Christianity. So with this, the justification for black servitude changed from a religious status to a designation based on race. I don't want to talk about Bacon's Rebellion just yet, but just that change alone, right? We'd already talked about the religious aspects of power in Christianity, and the European philosophers started moving towards natural law and moved away from faith based law, right? Well, as we see, Virginia turned the clock back in the mid 1660s. 1662, they created a law that based the child status on the mother status. As we know, most indigenous and African descended folks were enslaved, and in 1667, they did away with the religious component of slavery, right? So that is the basis for the American culture. That is the basis that the U.S., the United States of America, was built on. That's the foundation. That's the foundation. Yes.
Yes.
I'm turning it over to you. Any comments?
No,
What would you like to add? Yeah.
I'm just thinking, talking about the foundation of the United States, the foundation, those founding philosophies and the philosophers. Thinking about Hobbes and his understanding of rationality, the understanding of rationality, and seeing the savages, the subhumans, as irrational and consequently lesser humans, basically. But then, of course, this is it's all very contrived, isn't it? It's horrible how contrived this whole thing is, and how you can take these ideas and and just by weaving your own sort of nasty interpretation of philosophies and ideas, they managed to actually bring it into the simplistic notion of the marketplace. So you've got commodities as humans. You've got commodities, and at that time, when you introduce rationality and you take religion out of it, it all becomes about survival and surviving in the marketplace. Well, as you just said, that is the foundation of the states. I mean, capitalism, surviving in the marketplace. That's exactly what the United States is all about.
Yeah.
And even if that means trading in humans.
Yeah, 100%. That is real. And so I really, we're going to take a break in a minute, but I really want to drive that point home. And that's why I keep saying follow the money. So maybe not paper money, but follow the economics, right? The economics drove the need for the forced labor. Okay? Economics drove the need for forced labor. So then, oh, well, how do we get more profit? Okay, the indentured servant or someone working for their freedom, that's no longer profitable because I have to share my profit with that indentured servant. So if we can unify the small number of people over here, if we can unify them to believe that these other things, these other people, they're less than because they're savages, because they're subhuman, or they're poor. Oh, that's how we can have more profit because this is not anymore forced labor, it's now free labor. Oh, and wait a minute. How can we keep that system going? Oh, okay, let's change the actual law and go from, well, if any of the women have children and if they're enslaved, their children are now born into slavery. It's the economics that then drove the racial divide. But if I can propagandize that Jay is less than me because he looks different, and he's less than me because he's not wearing headphones and he doesn't have a microphone, that means I'm a better host than Jay is because he doesn't have those things. Does that make sense, logically speaking? But if I say it enough, if I say it loud enough, and if I keep pushing that, well, I'm the host, that's your co host. If I say it enough, people believe it.
Yeah, I'm already starting to feel a bit inferior, actually, Lee. I think we need to change the subject.
On that note, we'll take a break. I'll let Jay get his headphones. I'll let him get his microphone.
Yeah, thank you.
But let's take a break, digest all of that, and when we come back, we're going to dive into Bacon's Rebellion, which is really a huge turning point in moving forward with race. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. And just to let you know, while we were in the break, there were technical difficulties that happened that you know nothing about. So this is how we bring everything to you. No, just kidding. Um, but I'm glad that you were able to digest everything that we talked about before the break because it's
I hope
important
they
to
managed to
understand.
digest it.
Yeah,
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 there was
hopefully,
a lot
yes.
going
And please
on.
rewatch the episode if you need to go back over it. There's there is a huge historical context to understanding race is a social construct that was created for economic power and political power and staying in power for the elites. Okay? What I mentioned before the break is we want to talk about Bacon's Rebellion because that was a huge turning point. So let me share that. And Jay, I do have a few slides that also bring home the point of why this racial construct, this social construct of race was created. All right. So let's go ahead and jump back in here
Mhm.
with Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. So as we already found out that the laws that Virginia created basically kept women's children in perpetual servitude in slavery by changing that law in 1667 or 16, I think so. Now we get to 1676. Bacon's rebellion was short lived, but had a long reaching effect of the deepening racial divide in colonial Chesapeake region. That's in this Virginia area and pretty much the area where I live in today, by the way, just to let you guys know. Um, the coalitions of poor white people, free and enslaved Africans, rebelled against the rising class. They were planters because they wanted to acquire land that was reserved for indigenous people in Virginia. So the elite colonists determined they needed to amass more native land for their continued expansion. They wanted to pacify the poor European colonists who sought economic advancement, and they had to keep their dedicated labor force to do the grueling work of farming this land, the agricultural work. So by the mid 1700s, the new laws and societal norms linked Africans or people of African descent to perpetual labor, that is slavery, and the American colonies made formal these social distinctions among its people based on appearance, place of origin, and heredity. The Africans' physical distinctiveness marked their newly created subordinate position. To further separate the social and legal connections between lower class whites and African laborers, the enslaved or free, laws were put into place to control the interaction between two groups. These laws created the hierarchy based on race. So, as we were saying before those slides about Bacon's rebellion, that was key because you saw it as it termed it coalition, right?
Mm.
People started rebelling against the elite class. So it was poor whites, it was free African descent people, enslaved people. They were like, wait, now here's what's interesting about that Bacon's rebellion, and you guys can look it up for yourself and find the facts about this rebellion. This land, excuse me, that was for the indigenous people was being fought over by the enslaved, free African descent, and the poor white people. They're like, wait a minute, we want this land now. So, not giving it back to the indigenous folks who were there, but okay, the then elites also said, wait a minute, we need to expand our profitability. We need to expand our land. So that's where the rebellion came from. The people who were the have-nots were coming together to rise up against the haves. Okay? The
Mm.
haves recognized this And they're like, hold on. We've got to further the distinctions between people, and we've got to limit the access between the have nots. Basically, what I'm saying is they continue to propagandize and use the language or
Mm.
put into formal law that, these poor whites were better than and should not um, commingle with enslaved or free people of African descent.
Yes.
That's what Bacon's Rebellion led to, and continued on deepening this racial construct into the American fabric. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the same old rule of divide and conquer, right? I mean,
The, yeah.
driving the
When,
wedge between those people who were
yeah.
acting as one entity, one community,
Mm-hmm.
by stopping that, by separating and stopping any sort of mixing or mingling, you're gonna win the little battle that you've got going there, because
Divide
you're
and conquer.
eventually, yeah, get them on side, divide and conquer.
Yep.
Terrible, terrible thing, which obviously just worsened the whole situation for those
Yeah. Well, and
African
again,
communities.
and I want people to really understand it now. If you haven't remembered or heard or understood, I am a U.S. citizen, born here in the United States. I love being in this country, but I also understand how the country was born, how it was formed. I am not disillusioned by the forefathers and what they created. Now, that's why over the years there have been amendments to the US Constitution. But let me be clear, it was framed with these very things in mind, right? I want people to understand the forefathers were elite. Yes, they left the England in order to, don't believe that it was they don't believe the main reason was religious persecution. Okay? There was some of that, yes, but don't believe that was the main reason. Don't believe the main reason was for exploration, right? Let's see what's out in the world. The main reason, and you will hear me pound this until the days are done, economic freedom. Follow the money. So when they got here, oh, okay, there's no more land over there. I cannot change my status economically and become more elite or more wealthy. I cannot get higher up the ladder over there. So I'm going to come over here and be at the top of the food chain. I'm going to cement my status as elite. How am I going to do that? Okay, well, wow, this is really hard. Oh, there's people here, but they don't look like me. Oh, they don't understand my language. They must be inferior. They must be irrational because they're also not Christian. Oh my gosh, they must be savage. Oh, wait a minute, let's make a pit stop and bring some labor here because this work is pretty hard and I can't do this work myself. So I've got people working for me. Oh, wait, but if I look at them as people, that means I have to pay them. That means they may actually have feelings and emotions like I do. No, we can't do that. So that's how chattel slavery came. Chattel slavery is the subhuman context that was given to people of African descent, right? That's the subhuman part. When you no longer see a person as subhuman, that is the chattel
Well,
slavery
as
that,
human, yes, you
yeah,
stop seeing them as
or don't
human
even,
and you see them as subhuman. Yes,
exactly. And
or
the
just
indigenous
simply
people who
property.
were already here were savages. Savage is less than human, also. So
Mm.
that's how you cement your place. And then the people who follow you, oh, hey, okay, they're going to settle this new land. that look like you, right? That resemble you, but you're outnumbered. Well, let me see if I can bring all those people together who look the same, because those people, the savages and the subhuman, they are beneath us. So we need to band together in order to maintain our way of life. That's it. That's it in a
Well,
nutshell.
maintain and improve our,
Oh,
hopefully improve our economic
our
state.
our way of life. Yeah.
Mm.
So let me play a couple of videos, and then we can discuss them after we play. So hold on, I'll play this one.
Again, the whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added.
So they could do the math. Now, I want to get, I'm trying to find his whole presentation, by the way. I forget his name, but when I find it, I will share it with you, and then I'll share it on our next episode. But he did a presentation at Stetson College. That's what that presentation was about. Let me play one more, unless you have any comments about that clip.
No, I mean, it's rather a hurried summary of European history, which was a little bit.
he did kind of breeze through that a bit.
Yes, the poor Germans got a terrible rap, which I'm not sure is entirely fair, but there we go.
Very true. Very true.
but yes, essentially, it's as we are trying to stress through this whole thing. It's not about color. It's not about differences. It's not about race. It's all about economic superiority. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
Why
Absolutely.
superiority is essentially economic superiority. That's all it comes down to.
Yep. So then this is a clip now that hits home for today's world. All right. So let me play this. Hold on.
I don't know how it is you voted for Donald Trump when you're so into facts, because his entire campaign is not based in facts. It was all based in propaganda and emotion.
I voted for Donald Trump for one reason only. His policies, if implemented, would slow the dispossession of whites in the United States. If you were to deport all illegal immigrants, if you were to think very hard about letting in any Muslims, all of this would slow the rate at which whites are becoming a minority.
Why are you so worried about the white dispossession of America?
Because I want my people to survive. Is that so strange? We don't control China. We don't control any place where whites are not a majority. And if we become a minority, we will not control our own destiny anymore.
I grew up in this country as a minority, as the children of immigrants. I was their first child born in America. And while I didn't have much possession or didn't much control, I really enjoyed myself. You say that you wouldn't want me in this country?
At some point, when my ancestors built this nation, They did not build it with the intention of giving it away to Mexicans or Chinese or Haitians or to anyone else.
Do you consider it, you keep saying your ancestors built this country, you consider that a fact?
Who else built it?
Black people, Native Americans, Chinese people who came and built the railroads,
Do you think none of that could have been
Italian
achieved?
people.
But they're Europeans.
So embarrassing. So embarrassing.
I'll let you go first.
No, I mean,
Any thoughts or comments on that?
Oof, it's disgraceful. I don't know who that gentleman is.
Yeah, I don't remember who he was with the interview. Yeah, I'll try to find that as well.
But nonetheless, I mean, it's a discourse that you hear a great deal. I think the wonderful stupidity in all of this is our notions of my people, our great country. I mean, obviously, we're in the context of US. US, a nation built on immigrants, refugees, people fleeing. So I don't understand where the notion of my people comes from. Secondly, whose country? Yes, and that young man made a very good point. The building of that country. It's laughable. It's frankly laughable. And the curious thing, as always, is that if there's one thing that we see in Europe and in the US, the diversification of our populations, the mixing of nationalities, languages, cultures, actually only strengthens our countries, and that diversity is okay. It comes with complexities. It comes with some issues, but fundamentally, it's a massive strength, and that's been shown in every sense, in terms of our economies, in terms of our ability to become more accepting, far more accepting people, a better nation in many cases. Tolerance, religious tolerance, cultural tolerance, political tolerance, and all of that, if we're really interested in money, is positive, because that has a positive effect on the economy. I mean, it's crazy.
You're right. If you're interested in building wealth communally, then yes, the diversity is definitely a part of that, because it brings everyone up, right? And I love that interview because it hits home to the fact of the historical context that we've tried to have this conversation around. The elite wanted to, and want, even now in this day and age, want to stay elite. In order to do that, they use the propaganda of language or the smoke and mirrors to say, hey, look over here while I get to profit over here. But I'm going to distract you with all of these things over here, right? The illegal immigrants coming into the country, all the things that the guy was saying. I did not hear him say that I like Donald Trump as a man. I did not hear him say that I appreciate him and what he's, none of that. But he's trying to preserve his way of life for whatever that means. And I want to make this clear too. This is the space that we do this in. I'm not judging that man for wanting to preserve his way of life. I'm not going to judge him for that. I can't judge anyone for that. The issue that we are trying to bring to light, that Jay and I are bringing here, is that preserving your way of life, when it puts other lives in danger, that is what becomes the problem.
Takes or your desire to preserve your way of life takes away rights, privileges of others, that everyone should have the same access to all those rights and privileges.
Absolutely.
But one thing that is always quite strange is this notion that okay, like you said, preserve your way of life. Everyone is entitled to want to do that. Why not? I mean, if you enjoy your way of life, do everything you can to keep it. But we all, if you're playing a sports match, and until this point, you've won every match, you've won every single match, and you're on a winning streak, and you're doing ever so well. But you think this opponent might beat you. You don't poison the opponent. You don't break his legs between matches. You just improve your own game. You try and improve your own game to get back on top. If you enjoy your way of life and you see your winning streak and you don't want to lose it, you just keep on playing harder. But you don't attack the opponent. You don't take away their chances to still keep on growing and getting better. And that's,
in that very context, that's what was done, couple thousand years ago, right? Mid 1500s, 1600s, the breaking the opponent's leg, the poisoning the opponent. That was so in that very context, you're right. But how do you do that now? How do I maintain my dynasty, my winning streak? I'm not going to poison the opponent. I'm not going to go physically harm them. I'm just going to change the rules of the game.
Yes.
I'm going to change the rules of the game so that it keeps me here. And I will keep moving the way that you win so that as the opponent gets better, as the opponent continues to refine their skills, that, oh, wait a minute, the rules still benefit me in my dynasty. That's what we're seeing right now. There was something else I wanted to point out from before the break, the first segment that we did. In the initial the slavery and forced labor, there was something that I failed to mention. The people of African descent and from the African continent, they were brought over for the forced labor because of their skill set. I didn't point that out enough, but because of their skill set with agriculture, with bricklaying, with building, with all of these things that helped build a society, that's why the forced labor of African descent people was preferred, because they had these skills. So I think what we'll do is in future episodes, let's highlight how skilled these these past societies already were, and then they were brought into forced labor. That's something to really celebrate about other diverse cultures, what they were already doing, right? We want to highlight those things too. But in order to really have an understanding, we had to dive deeply into this social construct of race. We had to do that. Yeah.
But look, you're seeing here, we've got this as the foundation of the United States. We've got race being bandied about as a term which is used, invented and used to separate people, to maintain oppression, so that you disenfranchise groups and they just enter servitude and subordination. And that's continued for many, many, many years, even supported by not just the churches, by the Constitution, by all the political, religious constructs of that time. And we can see that as one of the terrible founding realities of the US. Nonetheless, the US hasn't done too bad to compare it until the present day. That doesn't mean it isn't traumatized as a nation, but how there is still this chasm of understanding. And I mean, the peculiar thing is looking at that man who was speaking on that last video with the young man. This wonderful thing about fearing his people were losing the grip somehow of power. An interesting thing there, in the US, the white population is still 75%. I don't think there's anything to worry about just yet. I mean, if this whole white fragility thing, I think there's still quite a strong dominant number there somehow.
Quite a bit. It maybe he's referring to his specific age group.
His age group and wealth group. Yes.
Right, that's what it is. It's not even age group, it's not even the people. You just nailed it. It's the economic group. That's the part that's changing,
Yes.
or that's the part that the elite don't want to share with anyone. I want my piece of the pie, and I want more pie, and I don't want to give you any. That's what we're working on changing. But I think, again, this conversation, we're using this platform so that understanding historically where it starts, you then can accept, okay, this is how it started, but I get to now make a choice in changing how it's going to continue. That's what we're trying to do,
Absolutely. And the language is key.
Big time.
I'm thinking actually just about the British in the Indian subcontinent. There were obviously through, not under the British state, but actually under the British East India Company. There were many British people over there in administrative positions and businesses and operating the trade routes. And I think it was like right during the 1700s, there was a huge number of these people who were taking Indian wives and blending into the society with hundreds of thousands of in like half Indian, half English children.
Sure.
And they were really quite integrated, but it was actually the church. On the arrival of the church, and they started demonizing the local Indians and seeing them as lesser. And that's what changed it. And it was only after the arrival of the church that you saw that trend reversing, and there becoming more of a separation and a segregation. And it's terrible. Again, it was, dare I say, religion putting its foot in and mucking up the waters.
Yes, well, I see. So that one was not economic. That was religious, in order to maintain your status, maintain or to create separation. And then, okay, elite, not elite, haves, have nots. It could be economics. It could be religion.
Well, it was
religion was that one. Yeah.
Religion was the church that was in there, but we would be foolish. We would be very, very foolish to assume that there was not economic motive behind it, because at the end of the day, the church was very interested in keeping its coffers full, and in order to do that, they needed to make sure that the huge wealth being created in India wasn't passed down through Indian generations, and it needed to stay in English hands.
In the church. Yes.
Yes.
I think I know where we're going to for at least another episode, if not more than that. Yeah. But Jay, I've appreciated you in your perspective, and hopefully everyone was able to as really take in this historical context, this information, and you can catch us right there at the bottom. If you go to Spotify, you can search the Live All Good podcast and search for the Move the Needle episodes, or you can go to our YouTube page and definitely find all the new episodes. Even go to the previous episodes, because we've touched on a lot of this previous episodes with previous co-hosts. I'm a constant, but we've had other co-hosts, but we've covered a lot of this information and open the conversation to understanding what is going on at this point
Hmm.
and how we can move forward by changing what has happened in the past. But no, that's not right. We can't change what happened in the past. We can change what we're going to do in the future. That's how I wanted to put that.
We can change what we're going to do in the future by understanding what happened in the past, and that's where we're trying to focus, isn't it? Because it's only really by understanding where you come from that you actually can have a clear picture of where you want to get to. I think with all of this, I love the fact that it just keeps on raising so many more questions. Like everything, the more you learn, the more you need to learn, right?
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
it's wonderful. It's wonderful, even if it's awful. If you follow my,
It's wonderful being curious to find out how we can do better. That's really how it goes. So,
no, absolutely. We'll get there one day. We'll get
absolutely. Just keep following us and keep listening, watching our show, listening to the show, and also do the homework yourself. Go ahead and research these things. Go ahead and
Yes,
dig a little bit deeper.
absolutely.
Sometimes it takes some time.
Mhm.
But Jay, until next time, until next episode, we'll
Yes,
see
sir.
you the next time.
Wonderful. Okay then. Take care.
All right,
Thank you.
folks.
Bye
Take
bye.
care.